Sorry, CFC, I pressed the wrong button. The screen started to fade, and I thought, oh no, what have I done? And so I couldn't figure out how to edit it from the end, so I have to have a volume 2, so I know you'll forgive me. I'll take that for granted, and that's a compliment. Um, but oh, the ode to the technically challenged like me. But I wanted to provide some scriptures as we think about a biblical perspective on the nature of freedom, and freedom mixed with moral responsibility to ourselves in all of our relationships, to our church, to our community, to our country. See, as I mentioned, Psalm 119, the psalmist says, I will walk about in freedom. And again, that psalmist has probably remembered the preface to the Ten Commandments. I know how to keep you out of bondage, says Yahweh. But the psalmist said in Psalm 119, verse 45, I will walk about in freedom. Why? For I have sought out your precepts. I'm not living just according to the whims of the will and selfish ambition, but I'm going to live according to the principles that keep me free as offered by Yahweh. The Apostle Paul, in his letter to the Romans, and again, remember, Romans was written 57 AD, less than 10 years before Nero would start his persecution of the Christian church, particularly the church in Rome. But he said in chapter 8, verses 20 and 21, for the creation was subject to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hopes, as it says in verse 21, that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay, the natural cycles of birth and death, the bondage to decaying towards the grave, be it plant life, be it animal life, be it all life. Be it sometimes the nasty and difficult competition amongst trees for sunlight and animals for food. The liberated will one day be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the glorious freedom of the children of God, the freedom that will be celebrated by all of God's earthly creation. Then the Apostle Paul, a couple years earlier, 55 AD, says to the Corinthian church, chapter 7, verse 20, each of you should remain in the situation in which God has called you. When God called you to himself, were you a slave? Then you are his freedman. If you were free, if you were a Roman citizen, then you are God's slave. The beautiful truth at two levels. I want to remind you, CFC, of the powerful truth of this, that in the church there was neither slave or free, neither male nor female. One of the greatest examples to me, there was a bishop of Rome, a pope, if you will, Tacitus was his name, who was the bishop of Rome from 217 to 222 AD. He was born a slave, and he becomes the bishop of Rome. And then that most important portion of Scripture as we celebrate our freedoms as citizens of the United States of America. Galatians chapter 5, verses 13. You, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. But do not use your freedom to indulge the sinful nature. Rather, serve one another in love. You're thinking of that Statue of Liberty on the East Coast and the Statue of Responsibility, which is the call to love one another unselfishly, selflessly. Right? The Apostle Peter, and again remember that he would die during the persecutions of Nero. Church history tells us that he would die upside down, crucified. He says in his first letter, chapter 2, verse 16, live as free men, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as servants of God. Then I'll close with this. If there's a playground that has a fence on its outskirts, children who are released for the playtime, recess, it's been observed that they will play in all of the areas, even right up to the excess, right up to the fence. They'll use the whole yard. But if there's no fences, and particularly if there's traffic around and roads around the park, the propensity is for them to stay closer to each other and closer to the center of the parking lot. I mean, of the park. The laws of God, oftentimes the restrictions, the calls of God, the prohibitions of God are like those fences that keep us from running into traffic and give us the freedom to employ and to explore all of God's bounty, all of God's gifts, all of God's green pastures, if you will. He's been given you freedom, not freedom as an occasion to the flesh, but by love to serve each other. Let's think this July 4th, not just about the Statue of Liberty, but also the Statue of Responsibility, as Viktor Frankl said. Let's celebrate our freedoms, but not make idols of our freedoms. Blessings on you, CFC. Stay encouraged.